Hello and welcome back to At the Symposium. Today we're going to be talking about nothingness. All right, so if you're back on our series on Jean-Paul Sartre's Being and Nothingness, we're going to be covering part 3 here, the dialectical concept of nothingness. Now, before we go through that, let's just recap what we've gone through in the last couple of weeks, because there is some special terminology and a lot of concepts that we've been covering throughout. The dialectical concept of nothingness is just on page 44. This is out of, about a 700-page book. So we're starting to get somewhere in the development of Sartre's philosophy. And you're going to see at the end of this chapter that we're really going to get somewhere, because he's going to start to take the conceptual kind of phenomenological stuff and start to go into kind of his existential philosophy. But in the first part, what we covered was the concept of being, and then we covered negation, and today we're going to do nothingness. So what was the concept of being? Remember that Sartre has two areas of being. He has the in itself and the for itself. The in itself you can think of as being without a consciousness, like something like an inanimate object. The for itself you can think of as being with a consciousness, like a human being. Now, well, what's interesting about that? Well, remember, this is phenomenology. So what he's trying to do is figure out, well, how does a being recognize itself? How does the being recognize the world? How does it realize things in itself and outside of itself? And again, why do you say, well, why does that matter? Well, because, again, remember, this is existentialism. This is a philosophy kind of rooted in exploring the human being in its most simplest form, in its most basic form, as just a conscious being, and then trying to step by step explain its way to how a human being gets to be a person with personality that makes different choices and takes part in different morals and value systems, and takes part in culture and being, having, and doing, which is his last chapter of the book, right? How does a person get from just being to then being, having, and doing? How does a person just get from being a conscious being to then being for others, being with others, okay? This is all an effort into making basically a grand philosophy. Okay, he's trying to, what Sartre's doing in Being and Nothingness is he's trying to come up with, from the ground root, an overarching philosophy of life, essentially, and of the human experience, which in a lot of ways is unique, because not all philosophers do that or venture to do that, which is something to take note of. I think a lot of times when someone says, well, I do philosophy, or I'm a philosopher, or I'm a philosophy professor, or something of that nature, people oftentimes maybe think that philosophers just philosophize about like life and lifestyle and beliefs and stuff like that. But a lot of philosophy is very technical, and you might only cover certain areas of certain philosophies. Like, take for instance, I studied a lot of epistemology, which is the study of knowledge. You could study moral philosophy, and you could ask specific questions about moral philosophy. That doesn't mean that you're creating your own moral philosophy while studying moral philosophy. Philosophers tend to critique other philosophers' work. Most of the academic philosophers, what we're doing is we're going through history, going through different ideas, doing kind of almost comparative literature, you could say, and doing comparative critiques on concepts having to do from a wide range of topics, like I said, epistemology to the philosophy of science to morals to political philosophy. Okay, not every philosopher makes their own kind of philosophy up from the ground. Now, I will say this: it was more popular to do such a thing in the earlier days of philosophy, going back to the Greeks and the Stoics and things of that nature. But as philosophy developed and got more academic, it started to kind of go away from kind of what I call like lifestyle philosophy or experiential philosophy. And it really started to ask more societal questions, right? Political philosophy questions, questions that had to do with more on the macro level, right? Not the micro. This is phenomenology. Jean-Paul Sartre is very much on the micro level of, the human experience as such, and bringing it from there, going into how the human being then negotiates itself with other people in society. But philosophy in modern times tends to deal with philosophy in the macro sense, regarding all the ins and outs of people and politics and social scenarios and culture and morality and things of that nature. So this is kind of unique. Jean-Paul Sartre is actually one of the last and most prominent figures in philosophy to develop a whole life philosophy, a whole conceptualization of what it is to be a human being. Really, like in the last century, he's one of the last ones to do that. This is one of the reasons why his work is so important. So we're going to start with the dialectical concept of nothingness. Again, so we have the being in itself, and we have the being for itself. Again, the being in itself, not a conscious being. The being in itself, not a conscious being. The being for itself is a conscious being. Then we had negation. What was negation? Remember, Sartre gave us the example of Pierre in the cafe. Pierre was in the cafe, and he was looking for Pierre in the cafe, and he couldn't find Pierre in the cafe. What was the example of that? Example of that was, I know that Pierre's not here, not because he's not here, not because I don't see him, but because everything else reveals itself to me as not being Pierre. So the idea of negation, which again, like I told you, this is part of the book that I tend to favor a lot, the phenomenological part, because it resonates a lot with other areas of philosophy and science. And you'll see this here also in the notions of nothingness. What he's trying to get across in negation, just as much as he's getting across in nothingness, is kind of the dialectical concept. If we haven't touched on the dialectical concept, this is an integral concept in phenomenology in general. That's in Hegel, that's in Heidegger, in the field of phenomenology. There's something called the dialectic. A dialectic is basically saying that, let's take the negation, for example. The dialectic is saying that to make an assertion, to make a judgment, even to make something, let's say a positive claim, that your positive claim isn't always something rest on just positive evidence. It also relates, the negative evidence also makes you able to draw a positive conclusion about something. So remember in the last chapter when we talked about how Sartre, the example of Sartre finding only 13 francs in his pocket when he was expecting 15 francs. That's where he was drawing on a dialectic relationship, meaning that I don't witness that I don't have by the fact of having less in the time in which I saw that I had less, but in the supposition that I thought I was going to have more, right? So it's kind of in a sense of the truth realized itself through me, through what I found that was lacking in the situation. So I thought I had 15 francs for 1,500 francs. I only have 1,300, but it was the idea that I had 15. And then seeing only 13 in reality is what brought the reality to me. So it's saying that the negative is just as much as important as the positive. What I didn't have in this situation also showed me what I did have in this situation. Just as much as Pierre not being there was not the only evidence that drew me to find the fact that he wasn't present, but everything else around me emerging, showing me that he wasn't there, because everything else wasn't Pierre. Okay, that's a dialectical relationship. So a dialectical relationship is to kind of take account for the negative. In life, we tend to always talk about things in a positive way. I think just because of language. So if we say, I see that, we don't talk about what we don't see. We don't think of when, I don't know, something, it's like colors, for example. We could relate the dialectical relationship to that, right? It's like if you put a blue dot on a background of white, it's the contrast that gets you to see the blue dot. If you put that blue dot on a blue background, you can't see the blue dot anymore because there's no contrast, and that's the dialectical relationship. It's a description of the contrast and saying that things come into being by contrast. They don't come into being necessarily just in and of itself. Again, you see the in itself. It has to maybe come in for itself. It comes in because there's someone conscious or some kind of conscious being that's able to see something in contrast to something else, which then it can realize things. We're going to get into that a little bit more, but we'll see how the notion of nothingness also plays into negation. Okay, so negation is the process of seeing the contrast. Okay, that being is revealed through contrast of nothingness and of non-being, and we're going to talk about that here. One of the first lines here that I want to go over is on page 47, and he's going to say, but non-being is not the opposite of being. Non-being is not the opposite of being. It is its contradiction. This implies that logically nothingness is subsequent to being, since it is being first posited, then denied. Negation cannot touch the nuclei of being, which is absolute plenitude and entire positivity. This means that being is prior to nothingness and establishes the grounds for it. By this, we must understand not only that being has a logical precedence over nothingness, but also that it forms being, that nothingness derives completely from its efficacy. Okay, so let's read this again. By this, we must understand not only that being has a logical precedence over being, but that it is from being that nothingness derives. Okay, and this is what I'm talking about with the idea of negation and the idea of the dialectic. We can, of course, again, relate this to something else. We can relate this to, let's say, science. How do we talk about space oftentimes? There's a whole debate. Is space really nothing? Is space really nothing? Most scientists would say that space is not necessarily nothing because it's space. It's somewhere in which there's an opportunity for things to emerge. Right, and this is kind of what Sartre is getting at. You can kind of even think of this in the qualitative sense of like the example of the pessimistic, the optimistic view of the glass being half full or half empty. Right, so the optimist is going to say the glass is half full, and one way to back that up with a phenomenological or dialectical kind of assertion is to say that the glass is half full, not because it's actually full, but because it also has the potential to be full because of the space and the volume that's available there to actually get it full to the brim. Yes, they're saying that the glass is half full. It's not half empty, and either way you articulate it, the same volume. If it's let's say a 1 liter bottle and it only has half of a liter, it's a half a liter from being full and it's a half a liter from being empty. But it's still half a liter. The dialectical thing to say would be that there's that space, and that space qualifies as an area in which we can actually fill the bottle up with more fluid. So again, going into what we see for being and nothingness is that the nothingness also qualifies as something because there's space for something to exist. And not only that, but there also needs to be a conscious being, a forward self-conscious being there to look at, to observe, and to notice and see the contrast of the nothingness, to actually bring it even into existence. So the nothingness can't just be nothingness. Nothingness, which is not, can have only a borrowed existence, and it gets its being from being. Page 52, he starts to go and have kind of some dialogue with Heidegger. Points in where he agrees and points where he contrasts with Heidegger. But this is one point that he agrees with Heidegger. Here he says, without a doubt, Heidegger is right in insisting on the fact that negation derives its foundation from nothingness. But if nothingness provides a ground for negation, it is because nothingness envelopes the not within itself as its essential structure. Nothingness can be nothingness only by annihilating itself expressly as nothingness of the world. Nothingness carries being in its heart. Okay, so this is the effort of this chapter. Again, is to kind of get into the idea that there isn't any nothingness without being. That nothingness needs being, and being might also be nothingness. Dialectical relationship. I always like to say this. It's kind of funny being the chicken farmer that I am, but this actually relates to the old adage, is it the chicken or the egg, right? That's the kind of dialectical relationship we're talking about. You can kind of even look at dialectical relationships almost as a paradox, right? Because we need the chicken to get the egg, and we need the egg to get the chicken, right? So which one came first? There's a lot of simultaneity in the dialectics, right? There's a simultaneity in being and nothingness. Nothingness doesn't just exist. It takes a being which realizes nothingness for nothingness to exist, and it might even realize the own nothingness of its existence while being conscious of its own being. Here we're on page 56 and 57. He's going to talk about the origins of nothingness. He says, nothingness is not nothingness. It is made to be. Nothingness does not annihilate itself. Nothingness is annihilated. It follows, therefore, that there must exist a being. This cannot be the in itself, of which the property is to annihilate nothingness, to support it in its being, to sustain it perpetually in its very existence, a being by which nothingness comes to things. Okay, and again, just like I said earlier, okay, so when he makes a point here to say there must exist a being, this being cannot be in itself, right? So it has to be a forward self being. It has to be a conscious being. So nothingness isn't just nothingness in itself. It can't just be nothingness in itself, because there's no way to know of nothing. So nothingness is not nothingness. Nothingness is made to be. Nothingness does not annihilate itself, meaning it cannot annihilate or negate itself. Nothingness is annihilated. So meaning that there's something, a conscious being, that's able to contrast it against something else. The being by which nothingness arrives in the world is a being which that in its being, the nothingness of its being is in question. Okay, now he just made it kind of a bigger leap here. This is page 57 at the bottom of the page. And this is where we're actually starting to get into the more existential side of the philosophy. So up until this point, he's really talking about just the ins and outs of his phenomenological view on being, negation, in itself, for itself, etc. Annihilation. Page 57, he makes the leap into, I don't know if he caught that, I'm going to read it again. He makes the leap into codifying this philosophy into the human experience. He says, the being by which nothingness arrives in the world is a being which that in its being, the nothingness of its being is in question. That is Jean Paul Sartre. That is him to a T. That is this book in itself. That is this book. Between that quote, there's probably no other quotes that distinguish his view and his target point of what he's trying to get at more precisely than that. And you're going to see that I'm wanting to reiterate that and point that out because it's going to, that line there is going to be repeated all throughout the book. There's this line and the existence precedes essence line that really codifies his whole philosophy here and what he's getting at. Let me read this again. The being by which nothingness arrives in the world is a being which that in its being, the nothingness of its being is in question. The nothingness of its being is in question. Now you see he's getting a little bit deeper. He's pushing beyond just the dialectic. Now he says the nothingness of its being, meaning that the being that realizes nothingness also sees nothingness in its being. Okay, now he's making an existential claim here. He's not just talking about consciousness. He's not just talking about contrast. He's not just talking about negation or annihilation. Now he's talking about the for itself, a being witnessing nothingness and then therefore also being able to see nothingness within itself. And if you're familiar with Jean-Paul Sartre, or if you know a little bit of existentialism, I think you kind of see where this is going here. And it's going to start getting a little bit clearer as we go on. The being by which nothingness comes to the world must be its own nothingness. Okay, these are like absolute claims for Sartre because remember, he's trying to build a philosophy. This is not just phenomenology, not just doing esoteric philosophizing about dialectics and perception and consciousness. He's trying to get somewhere. He's trying to build an image of what it is to be in the world, what it is to be a human being. And he's doing this, again, by way of discussing the dialectical viewpoints of consciousness and contrast. But his resounding claim, after he kind of gets through all that, is to say that the being by which nothingness arrives into the world is a being which that in its being, the nothingness of its being is in question. So it's in question. So saying that now the for itself is in question of itself. The for itself is in question of itself, and that the being by which nothingness comes into the world must be its own nothingness. I not just realize that nothingness outside, I realize the nothingness within myself. Very important point for Sartre. And this is going to connect now to his next point. Because again, we're crossing that bridge. We're getting away from just talking about phenomenology. Now we're going into human experience. He says, man is the being through whom nothingness comes to the world. But this question immediately provokes another. What must man be in his being in order that through him nothingness may come to being? We have already noticed furthermore, that with man, the relation of existence to essence is not comparable to what it is for things in the world. Human freedom precedes essence in man and makes it possible. The essence of the human being is suspended in his freedom. What we call freedom is impossible to distinguish from the being of human reality. Man does not exist first in order to be free subsequently. There is no difference between the being of man and his being free. Okay, again, another resounding point for Sartre. If you want to get into the meat of what this is about, page 60 now. Page 57, page 60. He's getting into the meat of what he's trying to talk about what his whole philosophy is based on are these ideas. His ideas, existentialism, it's man is thrown into the world free, but has to distinguish himself and has to figure out how and what he wants to be. That's existentialism here. Again, codified through this statement. Man does not exist first in order to be free subsequently. Right? He wants to get away from this idea because all the time, political philosophies, social philosophies, people are always acting like man is always in this perpetual struggle to be free. Man is in chains. You have Rousseau, you have, Hobbesian kinds of philosophies. What he's saying here, that's like, no, man is freedom. Man does not live to be free. Man is freedom. Page 65. In freedom, the human being is his own past, as also his own future, in the form of annihilation. So, which is getting a little bit deeper, but what he's basically saying is the forest self, the human being, they have the possibility and authority to basically to change. They have the opportunity to annihilate themselves. They have the opportunity to change. Page 65, after that line, he's going to start talking about another one of his integral concepts. A lot here in this chapter because he's getting into some of his into the meat of his philosophy. We saw first that he talks about the nothingness of a being and how we recognize nothingness out there, but we also see it in our own being and how that relates to our freedom. Now he's going to take the next step in saying that the nothingness that we see out there in the world, it's recognized by a being which also recognizes the nothingness in and of itself. And that nothingness also insinuates a certain kind of freedom that being has. And because that being is nothing, because if the being is nothing, if the being sees nothing and the being recognizes nothing in itself, then it has a freedom to become whatever it would like to become. But because it recognizes that freedom, it has, well, he's going to talk here. It is in anguish that man gets the consciousness of his freedom. Or if you prefer, anguish is the mode of being of freedom as consciousness of being. It is in anguish that freedom is, in its being, in question for itself. Okay, again, another straight line to Sartre's philosophy. He goes on to try to quote a little bit of Kierkegaard, because Kierkegaard kind of had the same kind of feeling. There's, kind of these kind of notions exist in other realms of philosophy. But I mean, one thing distinguishing Kierkegaard against Sartre, Kierkegaard is known more as a Christian existentialist. Sartre is a more of a secular existentialist. But they both play on this idea of anguish. This idea of anguish and angst is going to be an integral part of Sartre's existential philosophy, not his phenomenology, but his existential philosophy, meaning that because man realizes the nothingness which he is or has or observes in himself, he realizes also that he is free, and through recognizing his freedom, he recognizes a certain anguish that comes along with that because of all the myriad of possibilities that they witness amongst themselves and the possibilities of their very existence. If I am nothing and I realize that I have all this freedom, and it also puts me in a state of angst and anxiety about what I am to become. So here on page 65, he introduces his next integral concept, which is anguish. Anguish is precisely my consciousness of being my own future in the mode of not being. So anguish, it's kind of like those moments of anxiety that someone gets when they get excited that they want to do something and they realize, well, oh, but you're not there yet. Like you want to do something, but you're not there yet, but you want to be. Sartre calls this anguish. Thus the self which I am depends on the self which I am not yet. Thus the self which I am depends on the self which I am not yet, to the extent that the self which I am not yet does not depend on the self of which I am. Again, another dialectical play. What is he trying to get at? He's trying to get at this notion of always becoming, right? Realizing what you are, realizing what you're not, realizing that you're trying to become something, realize you're not what you're trying to become. This constant interplay of man realizing itself as nothing and then trying to be something and realizing that it's not what it's trying to be and wants to keep trying to be what it's not. Thus the self which I am not depends on the self which I am. Just the self which I am depends on the self which I am not yet, to the extent that the self which I am not yet does not depend on the self of which I am. So from here, Sartre is going to start talking about one of his next biggest concepts. And I'm going to leave this for the next video. He starts to talk about bad faith. This is another integral concept in his existential philosophy. That's going to be of utmost importance as we go along. But today we've covered a really, really critical point in this philosophy, again, where he shifts from the phenomenological over to the existential, and he does that with realizing the nothingness of the human being, which then makes the human being realize their freedom, and their freedom is also recognized as anguish because of the amount of possibilities that one recognizes they have for themselves. But the next step is there that then is that, well, how do we avoid making the wrong decisions, or in Sartrean terms, how do we avoid being in bad faith? And that's what we'll talk about next week at the symposium.